On the 15th of August, 1965, the Beatles walked onto a stage at Shea Stadium in New York in front of 55,600 people, the largest audience any concert had ever drawn anywhere in the world. Behind the band, straining against a wall of screaming, stood a row of the most powerful amplifiers then in existence, each carrying one word in bright chrome: Vox. The word was Latin. The amplifiers were English, designed by a partially deaf engineer in a workshop in Dartford, Kent, for a company founded by a man who had started out repairing accordions. On that evening, a little Kent firm stood at an altitude no British instrument maker has reached before or since. The biggest band on earth played its gear exclusively. The biggest concert in history ran on it. Here's what the 55,000 screaming people could not know. 1 year earlier, almost to the week, the men who ran that company had signed an agreement with an organ manufacturer in California. The trade press called it the $1 million deal. It was meant to be the key to America. The one market Vox had conquered with its sound, but not its sales. Within 3 years of that signature, the founder would be escorted out of his own company in tears. Within 4, the receivers would be selling the contents of the Dartford workshop for cash. And the word Vox, the coolest name in British music, would begin a journey through so many corporate hands that today it belongs to a Japanese company, and the amps are built in Asia. That is the contradiction at the center of this story. Vox won America's ears completely and lost everything else to America almost as fast. A British workshop built the sound of the decade, put it on the biggest stage on the planet, and discovered that building the sound and keeping the empire are two entirely different kinds of victory, and that Britain, in the 1960s, had mastered only one of them. If that's the kind of history that interests you, the empires Britain built and how it lost them, subscribe and stay for what happened next. The story starts, as a surprising number of British audio stories do, in the Second World War, in a munitions factory. Tom Jennings was a South London tradesman's son who repaired accordions and traded second-hand instruments. During the war, he was assigned to work at a Vickers munitions plant in Kent, and there he met a young guitarist named Dick Denny. Denny was deaf in one ear. A perforated eardrum had kept him out of uniform and put him on the factory floor. Hold on to that detail. It may be the most consequential ear injury in the history of popular music. After the war, Jennings opened a shop in Dartford, then a company on Dartford Road, then a hit product, the Univox, a portable valve-powered keyboard, and by the summer of 1956, the operation had a grand new name, Jennings Musical Industries, JMI. If that sounds a bit like EMI, so did Tom Jennings. That was the point, and his timing was perfect. Skiffle and American rock and roll were sweeping through British youth, putting guitars into hundreds of thousands of teenage hands. And every electric guitar needs the one thing it cannot provide for itself: volume. Jennings understood before almost anyone that the coming gold rush would not only be in guitars, it would be in the boxes that made them loud. In 1957, he hired the deaf guitarist from the munitions factory, and what came out of that workshop is the reason this video exists. An electric guitar on its own is almost silent. A pickup, a coil of wire around a magnet, turns the string's vibration into a whisper of electricity, and the amplifier's job is to make that whisper enormous. In the 50s, that meant valves, glowing glass tubes that, pushed hard, don't just enlarge a sound, they warm it, compress it, and finally make it sing. Most American designers engineered their amps to stay clean and polite. Dick Denny did the opposite, and partly because of his ear, his AC-15 of 1958. And then, when the Shadows, Britain's biggest instrumental group, needed to beat the screaming of bigger and bigger crowds, the AC-30 of 1959 ran their valves in what Vox called Class A operation, without the negative feedback rivals used to keep things tidy. The result was a bright, chiming, bell-like voice that seemed to glitter, a sound that became known simply as the Vox chime. One of Vox's own engineers, John Oram, later offered the most haunting explanation of it. When Denny voiced an amplifier, he probably wasn't hearing what everyone else heard. He tweaked the sound until it was crisp for him. The chime of the 60s is one man turning up the sparkle until it pierced his own damaged hearing. Britain's most famous sound is, at its origin, a compensation for a deaf ear. Then came the handshake that turned a sound into an empire. In 1962, Brian Epstein, Impeccable Suits, a Liverpool band with worn-out amps, came to an arrangement with JMI, formalized through sales manager Reg Clark. The Beatles would receive Vox equipment free or close to it, forever. Worn fawn amps traded in for new black ones. Bigger rigs supplied as the rooms grew, in exchange for using Vox exclusively on stage. As the gear historians tell it, Epstein promised that as long as he managed the Beatles would play Vox. Consider how cheap that was. No money changed hands to speak of. A workshop's worth of amplifiers bought the most valuable product placement of the 20th century. John Lennon had already bought his own Fawn AC-15 from Hesse's music shop in Liverpool that July for £123. File that receipt away, because 62 years later, it becomes the punchline of this entire film. When 73 million Americans watched The Ed Sullivan Show in February 1964, the amps in shot said Vox. As Beatlemania created a problem no amp maker had ever faced, audiences measurably louder than the band, Dartford built bigger and bigger boxes. 30 watts, 50, 100, all the way to that August evening at Shea, where the mightiest rigs a British workshop could conceive lost gloriously to the crowd. There were no monitors. The band kept time by watching Ringo. It didn't matter. The image mattered. The biggest concert in history, and every amplifier on stage said Vox, and the conquest ran deeper than amplifiers. JMI's Vox Continental, a sleek, reverse-keyed portable organ introduced in 1962, ended up on some of the defining American records of the decade. The Animals rode Alan Price's swirling Continental to #1 with the House of the Rising Sun. A Michigan garage band called Question Mark and the Mysterians cut 96 tears around the organ hook everyone hears as a Vox. The band themselves credited a Continental. And in Los Angeles, Ray Manzarek put one at the center of the doors and played Light My Fire on it. British beat groups, American garages, Californian psychedelia. The instrument under all of them came from Dartford Road. Lennon himself played a Continental at Shea, hammering the keys with his elbows. There were guitars too, and they carried their own irony. For much of the early 60s, JMY held the British distribution rights for Fender. The company dreaming of beating the Americans spent its mornings unpacking crates of Stratocasters, instruments so exotic in import-starved Britain that Hank Marvin's famous first Strat had cost around £140, roughly 3 months' wages for a working man. Tom Jennings knew better than anyone what a Fender was worth. He had been opening the boxes. His answer, in 1962, was a very British piece of audacity. He commissioned the London Design Centre, a government showcase whose usual business was kettles and furniture, to draw guitars that looked like nothing else on earth. Not played better? Looked like nothing else? Back came the coffin-shaped Phantom, and the rounder shape the music press nicknamed the Teardrop. And in 1964, a white Teardrop, its prototype built specifically for him, toured America in the hands of Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones, and became one of the most recognizable guitars of the decade. The shape you see in half the photographs of the Stones' first conquest of America. But the workshop was one factory trying to be three. Amps, organs, guitars. And by 1965, guitar production had quietly crossed the channel to the Echo factory in Recanati, Italy. A sensible decision. Also a rehearsal, though nobody saw it, for the idea that would kill the company, that the name and the thing could be separated, and the name would keep its magic on its own. Because the real separation had already been signed, in the best month the company ever had. Put yourself in Tom Jennings' chair in August 1964. Your amps are behind the biggest act in entertainment history. American teenagers are saving for anything with your badge, and you are a medium-sized workshop in Kent that cannot come close to building enough. America was the prize, the market every post-war British exporter had been told. For 20 years, was the whole point of British industry, and here was America knocking. It knocked in the form of the Thomas Organ Company of California and its president, Joe Benarin, offering the $1 million deal. Exclusive U.S. distribution, opening with a commitment to $1 million of equipment, the first shipments leaving for Chicago and California within weeks. On paper, it was everything a British exporter dreamed of. Instant, massive access to the richest market on Earth, with a powerful partner carrying the freight. It was the death sentence. Understand the machine on the other side of the table. Thomas Organ sat inside Warwick Electronics, with Sears, Roebuck holding a controlling stake, and Whirlpool soon in the picture. Decisions about Britain's coolest music brand would be reviewed by men whose businesses were home organs, mail order, and washing machines. And Joe Benarin was an organ executive in the transistor decade. To him, a valve amplifier was a hot, heavy, expensive appliance built on doomed technology. Confronted with bottomless American demand that Dartford couldn't possibly supply, he reached the obvious American conclusion: build Vox in America. From mid-1965, at a plant in Sepulveda, California, Thomas built its own solid-state transistor Vox amps. Remember what the valves did? Strain, bloom, sing. Transistors just get louder, then ugly. The California amps, including a flagship called the Super Beetle, built so every American teenager could buy the amp the Beatles never actually played, looked spectacular, and sounded nothing whatsoever like an AC-30. Dick Denny was flown out to inspect them, the founder of the sound, politely reviewing amplifiers that ignored every principle he'd built. Acted on. There is no record of what he said. There doesn't need to be. In October 1965, Benarin secured the exclusive American rights to the Vox name itself. And from then on, in the biggest market on Earth, Vox meant a Californian transistor amp, and pennies on those American dollars ever crossed back to Dartford. Even that might have been survivable if the British money had stayed in the business. It did not. Back in early 1963, needing capital, Jennings had sold a controlling interest to Royston Industries, a holding group whose great bet was a flight data recorder, an aviation black box called Midas. The airlines chose its competitors. So, through the very years Vox stood on top of the world, the profits of Britain's coolest company were being siphoned upward to prop up a failing avionics project. The workshop that needed a bigger factory to feed the greatest demand any British instrument maker had ever seen was funding flight recorders instead. From the inside, at the moment of maximum glory, the empire was being quietly bled. By 1967, the arithmetic ran out. On the 29th of September, the board dismissed Tom Jennings from the company he had founded. The final row, as his colleague John Oram told it, ignited over a silver Jaguar E-Type Jennings had ordered without approval. A car. After the Beatles. After Shea. After the Millions. A company car. Oram remembered him emerging with tears running down his face. Those bastards have kicked me out of my own company. Denny was gone within months, and in December 1967, Royston itself collapsed under more than £1 million of debt, and the receiver took charge. Sit with the timing. From Shea Stadium to the receivers, 28 months. Not a decline, a trapdoor. The band was still famous, the amps still glorious, the sound still everywhere. Only the money was gone, and it had been gone, invisibly, for years. Equipment sales in the Dartford sheds, stock sold to men with vans. Then, the long past the parcel of the name, through British electronics firms, through Dallas Arbiter and Rose Morris, until Korgs of Japan bought it in 1992, under whom the AC-30 is built, well and faithfully, in Asia. The chime survived. Everything around it did not. One strange footnote, because this story twists the knife almost too neatly. Inside that Thomas plant in California, in 1966, an engineer named Brad Plunkett was tinkering with a tone circuit and stumbled onto something nobody had heard before. A sweepable filter that made a guitar cry like a human voice. Thomas sold it under the Vox name. It was the wah-wah pedal, the sound of Hendrix, of Clapton, of 1,000 funk records. Savor that. the American operation that could not reproduce Britain's most famous guitar. Sound accidentally invented the next one, and Denny's strangest invention got its own punchline. The guitar organ, a phantom with an entire Continental squeezed inside, was presented to John Lennon amid great fanfare. He kept it, liked it, and never recorded a note with it. In 2014, that unplayed prototype sold at Sotheby's for $305,000. The future Vox promised the world was never used and became priceless anyway. So, the verdict read once in money and once in sound. In money, Vox is the cleanest cautionary tale Britain ever produced, and note that there is no villain in it. Royston genuinely needed the money. Benarin genuinely believed in transistors. Jennings genuinely needed the capital. An empire dismantled entirely by reasonable men making reasonable decisions about a thing whose value none of them could see, because its value lived in a circuit's misbehavior and a deaf man's ear, and neither appears on a balance sheet. Jennings went back to Dartford Road, almost next door to his old works, and built amps under a new name, small and proud and never big again, until he died in 1978, 60 years old, within sight of the empire that no longer knew him. Denny lived to 80, the beloved elder statesman of British amplification, signing AC30s at guitar shows, and died in June 2001. Neither man got rich. Both outlived the corporation that discarded them. In sound, Vox never fell at all, and the collectors have delivered their ruling. A JMI Era A C30, actually built at Dartford in the early 60s with its Celestian blue speakers, is today one of the most coveted amplifiers on Earth, trading for many times the price of its later descendants, because the original circumstances cannot be repeated. A particular workshop, a particular handful of hands, a particular deaf man turning up the treble until he could hear it sparkle. You can reissue a circuit. You cannot reissue 1963. In 2024, John Lennon's own first Vox, the Fawn A C15, he bought in a Liverpool shop in 1962 for £123, later found disguised under black paint by a fan who paid $16,000 for it, sold for £151,200, the highest price ever paid for an amplifier. And the chime itself simply refused to die. Brian May built the entire cathedral of Queen's guitar sound on a wall of AC30s. Rory Gallagher carried the flame through the 70s, the edge through the 80s. Somewhere on a stage tonight, an AC30 is chiming exactly as it chimed behind the Beatles, and most of the audience has no idea they are listening to Dartford, Kent. What does the story reveal about Britain? The pattern this channel will keep returning to. Britain in the 1960s was better than anyone alive at making the thing, and catastrophically worse than America at owning the thing. The country that invented the sound of the decade exported the glory and imported the invoice. Vox conquered America so completely that America simply kept it. And the two men who made it all, a deaf engineer and an accordion repairman from a munitions factory, ended where they began on Dartford Road, listening to their own sound come back across the Atlantic, wearing someone else's ownership papers. The empire fell. The sound remains. And if this is the kind of story you come back for, Britain building brilliant things in sheds and losing them to bigger hands, the next one is waiting, and it starts in exactly such a shed. Two brothers in South London who decided, with almost no money and a lot of nerve, to build Britain's own answer to Fender. What they made, half of British rock learned to play on. See you in the next video.